Today, the video is going to be a little different. Instead of scraping reeds, I'm going to show you some reeds that have been scraped. But before we begin, I just want to let you know that the advertising that you see before the videos have nothing to do with me. I make no money on any of these videos, and they're strictly for educational purposes. Many years ago, I flew out to Arizona to have a reed lesson with David Weber. This was in Chandler. This was in the early 2000s. I wanted to know more about reed making, and having come from Boston and then being thrust into the Midwest, there were varying styles that were clashing, so I just wanted to get some help and some insight. And I went out and spent an entire day with David, and we talked about oboe, we talked about bores, we talked about bells and sound production and embouchure and his method of scraping, and it was really an incredible experience. And I'm glad I did it. David Weber went to school with, he was a classmate of Richard Woodham. They were at Curtis together, as far as I know. And they studied with Delancey. Now, Delancey's style of reed making and Woodham's and Weber, they're very different. I call it New Philadelphia because of the influence of Richard Woodham's and David Weber in their reed making style. It's sort of like they invented it, based on a stronger gouge. Now, Delancey and Tabato, you know, that was a different gouge. It was a much weaker gouge. It was a graph gouge mostly, from what I know, which is what most people used in those days. And the curve was made so that the sides would be thicker, but that brings in inherent weaknesses. It helps with the tone, it helps with low register, but it does bring in weaknesses. This reed style, which I call New Philadelphia, because it doesn't really have anything to do with its predecessors, was one based on strength. And this is one of David's hallmarks, is that he based the reed, the gouge, on strength, and they made the reed from strength to weakness, as opposed from weakness to strength. And this is the split in American reed making, and a lot of people are kind of confused by it, but there's definitely a divide. I've spoken with Mr. Woodhams, and he's requested cane from me in the past, and he likes harder cane, and he likes a heavier gouge. He said up to 62. He doesn't mind if the reed cracks on the tube, which is fairly irrelevant anyway in most cases. But they have a style of reed making that is, they scrape against the gouge. And this is something that David emphasized to me, was that when he scrapes a reed, he scrapes against the gouge, which means that you're scraping against the curve. You're scraping kind of flat. I spent an entire day with him, and at the end of the day, I said, you know, this has been an incredible experience, but I'm going to get on that plane, and I'm going to forget, like, most of what I've experienced here today, what I've learned, short memory and whatnot. I didn't take a lot of notes. He did do some drawings, and I have some of those. Maybe I can show you those. But they're similar to his book. But I said, you know what, I've got a bunch of blanks. Could you scrape a reed for every step of your reed making process? And that way I can have a visual reference to how I should scrape the reed when I'm working on it. And he's like, yeah, no problem. He's such a fine reed maker. His scraping was so clean. It's hard to describe really, really clean tips right off the bat. The dimensions, the overall consistency of the reed making. It was really rather incredible to watch him do it. What I have in front of me are the reeds that he scraped. And these are reeds that he scraped for each step of the way. And I'd like to go through them and show you and maybe talk about what his idea of the scrape should be. So let's start with the first one. And this is based on just making the tip. So he scraped a tip. And look how nice that is. The profile is just really beautiful. And we can see how clean that tip is. And we can see the profile and how nice that profile is. And in scraping it, it's very blended at first. Right? There's a lot of blending going on. There's definition, but there's blending. And I just really like that profile. It's very, very nice. I think profile in a lot of ways tells you more about the reed than anything. You can see how that is scraped. And look how it's kind of scraped from the center. And like he describes, it's like we start out like it's a French reed. right? And you can see that in the scrape as he starts it. But really clean tip, really nicely done. He's laying out his proportions, which you can see in his book. And then the next step, this is the second step, as he starts scraping the channels. You see, as that profile is really nice, and that is something that a lot of us kind of have difficulty with. Getting that profile, I think, is more important than just about anything. It's getting that profile. Look how straight that is, and smooth and tapered at the end. That's what you want to get in your reed making. In this step, in this third step, he's beginning to put in some definition. You see that? The defined. He's defining the sides. So now he's scraping in the channels of the heart. He's got the tip scraped away, as you can see, nice and clean. Really clean tips. I mean, it's remarkable to see it. And you know, he did it in seconds flat. I mean, in no time this was done. And his principle, as we've talked about, is scraping flat against the gouge. So he's, I don't know if we can really see it, but he's trying to scrape against the gouge. It may be difficult to see, but he's scraping flat against the curve. You can still see the blending and some definition, but not overly done. Just really clean. Whereas in the second step, even though it's clipped, he hasn't defined the sides. It's still rather tapered. And this step being the first, he has definition in there, even though it's not distinct. Whereas the third, this is where he's putting in definition. And you have to with a strong gouge, with this style. You must have this definition. Because with weaker cane, weaker gouges, there's more blending. With stronger, there's more definition. Otherwise the tip will not vibrate. Okay, so now we get to the fourth, where it's been clipped. Fourth reed has been clipped. He still hasn't put the back in yet, has he? He's working with the front of the reed and getting this relationship done first. Reed is vibrating. And he said, you know, during the lesson, he's like, look, it's like we start out with a French reed and then we finish. You see the definition, the length of the tip, and the flat scrape in the channels. And he's leaving a spine there too as well. Always note that the shorter tip is facing you, and that's why I clipped the tip with the thread facing you. You always play the reed with the shorter tip facing you. That's very important. Okay, and then we get to the final parts of the reed where he scrapes the back. Now look at how he scraped very flat. Look at that. Flat and clean, and he finishes toward the back of the heart. Right? He's scraping right into the back of the heart. And in fact, when I was scraping a reed with him and I started to scrape aggressively toward the back of the heart, he's like, that's what I want to hear. I want to hear the knife make that sound. But that's a really flat scrape. And this helps the reed, especially if it's a strong setup, to vibrate. There's definition, there's proportion. And so that is the fifth reed that he scraped for me. You can see there's definition, but it's also tapered. Very nice. Really beautiful tip. I think the profile says more about the reed than just about anything with this style. Those are the 5 reeds that he scraped for me, and then he scraped a couple more, which he finished. And then I'll show you, this is green thread. And so this is one of the reeds that he scraped from the beginning of the lesson. And you can see, you know, it's a classic style reed. There's more emphasis further back when I say that when you're dealing with a strong gouge or strong setups, you're going to have a longer tip and you're going to have a longer heart. But it'll be slightly flatter, and the back will be scraped more toward the back of the reed. And this frees up the reed. This is how it vibrates, because strong gouges, strong cane doesn't want to vibrate. You have to make it vibrate. And that introduces a lot of lows. He finishes the scrape somewhat aggressively toward the back of the heart, so that it's stepped as well. You can see that it's stepped and blended in the back. And you have that definition at the beginning of the tip. I'm not sure what the shape is at the time I was making these reeds. It's a decent shape. Look at the length of the tip. See, it's a little long, but it's just a really nice profile. It's tapered. It's not anything that is abrupt. And it's part of his philosophy of scraping against the gouge. Well, I hope that helps. It was an interesting endeavor to look at the reed and to kind of see what makes it vibrate. So let me know if you have any questions, and maybe this will give you a little insight.